Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. Now in this live chat, I'd like to talk about the decline of Britain and the British Empire. And this has amazed and awestruck many historians over the years. And because there's so much written information and data around to examine, it's probably the most examined decline of any empire ever in the history of studying history. So the Roman Empire, we've got a few bits and pieces we can sort of patch together and work out how it all happened. But with the British Empire, it's right there. We've got every bit of paper and every attitude, every parliamentary speech, the whole thing. So we can see how the empire declined. We can see its decline day by day, year by year, and we can sift through all that information and that data to draw conclusions. And with the decline of any empire, there are, of course, many similarities, and we see that the decline of the American empire today has similarities to the decline of the British Empire, which we can reasonably presume has similarities to the decline of other empires, whether it be the Spanish Empire or for that matter, the Roman Empire and so on. So let's start with Britain before it was had any real clout or power. So it's an island off the coast of Europe, and back in the day, in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, it was seen as a small bit player. It was never really going to engage decisively with continental affairs. There were issues where, and a lot of people think that there was a war between the French and the English, but Joan of Arc and all that sort of stuff, but that's bullshit. A French duke invaded England and took the English throne, and of course he still had all his French territories there, and there was a constant war then going on between the descendants of those French dukes, which of course now had the English crown as well, and the other people in France that wanted pieces of that territory, and there was so it was really a situation of civil war that went on for many hundreds of years in effect. So the French-British wars were to a large extent civil wars. But even until sort of the early 1700s, Britain was seen as a bit of an outlier. It didn't look like it was going to go places. The English Civil War had seen the killing of the king, the execution of the king. Then the king's son, many years later, was invited back to try and unite the nation. The nation was reliant very much on French subsidies to get by. So you're looking at a fairly weak power that in a war with Holland, for example, the Dutch managed to sail a fleet right up the River Thames and sink many English ships right in the centre of London almost. And because Britain was so poor and disorganised and so on, the castles with the cannons that could have theoretically sunk the Dutch fleet that was coming down the Thames, they had no cannonballs, or if they cannonballs, they had no powder. So England looked like it just wasn't going to go anywhere. It was pretty sad and pathetic. I guess the English king married a Portuguese princess, and this was in the earlier 1700s or late 1600s, earlier 1700s, and I should have written that date down, but I didn't. And so the Portuguese, is like a wedding dowry, gave certain colonies to Britain as part of that deal. But the comments from the Portuguese ambassador who accompanied the princess to England commented on what a vulgar, unlawful, riotous sort of population the British were. They were defecating in the street. They were unrefined. They had the most terrible, vulgar manners, and so on and so forth. So the Portuguese ambassador back then wrote England off as being they're just a bunch of bums. They'll never do anything and never get anywhere, and they're not worth a pinch of shit, and so on. So that was the general idea that the Portuguese had, and The Portuguese at the time were artificially wealthy because of the gold and silver that was coming out of South America, and the plantations were set up in what today is known as Brazil. So they fancied themselves probably as being more refined than they really were. But nonetheless, that was the view. And it was a similar view that was held in the courts of Louis XIV and so on in France and in amongst the Spanish Empire and so on. Also, Britain at that stage, or England at that stage, had become Protestant, particularly after Henry VIII and the split with the Catholic Church and the embracing of many of the principles from Martin Luther, as indeed had parts of northern Germany and so on. So Britain at that stage was off to an inauspicious start. You couldn't have figured they were going to do anything big time. Yet the raw materials were there for those who were able to see it and see it as very few ever can, to prognosticate the rolling, tumbling dice of history and which way it's going to go, and the various forces that arrive at certain times to move things along in a certain direction. For example, Britain had many internal rivers and streams that were navigable, but also could be used for things like water wheel power. They also had many areas of high wind, could be used with windmills, and windmills did a lot of grinding and things like that. So there's a whole lot of things there, as well as coal, copper, a lot of deep water ports that could take heavily laden merchant ships. There were vast forests of oak trees that could be used to build sturdy ships and so on. So there were a lot of things there that were if a nation was going to involve in some sort of economic or industrial takeoff, there were a lot of the raw materials there for the then technology that existed. The internal streams, rivers as an example, moving goods around, moving raw materials from here to there, moving building materials around. I mean, there are all sorts of things that these internal rivers, and not every place had internal rivers that were that good for internal navigation and moving things around. So this was also important. Now, when England started to take off on trade, it already was developing a mercantile empire, and this was a stop and go affair. So names like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and various other players going around setting up trading networks, trading posts in various places, the British East India Company, and so on. So there was a lot of private activity there in setting up those international trade routes. Now, why did Britain become so prominent in the mercantile age, or at least set the basis for what would later be the industrial age? Nearly every rival Britain had at the time in ship technology, so sailing technology, and at the day, the ability to sail obliquely across the wind, for example, was something that was very important. Not many sailors or shipbuilders were prepared to or able to build ships that could travel in open oceans. Remember that many people thought the world was flat in those days, and you simply sail off the end and disappear into some hellish abyss. So that minds weren't focused on that, but the Europeans, the Portuguese, to some extent, the Italian trading cities such as Venice, and the Europeans generally were looking at somehow getting away from that east-west Silk Road, as it was called, that was controlled by the Muslims in between Turkey and India and China. So the motivation to build ships that would go around that and find another route to the east. There was a lot of focused energy at the time put into that, and the early navigators, such as particularly the Dutch, were active there, as were the Portuguese and the Spanish. So this is where the routes were opened up, say going around the south of Africa to get to India and China and those routes. And because the cost and the time of moving things over the land on the Silk Route was so high, the relative cost of moving things around by sea, even though the distances were vast, it was still economically feasible to do it that way, particularly given the prices that were being charged by the Islamic nations. So this was this building of a trading empire, the beginnings of it at the very least. The British were certainly prominent in that. Now, all of England's rivals at the time for this international commerce were all located nearby. So they were consisted of the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese. So they were all close by. So if there was going to be a war, the resources that the British had to employ didn't have to be spread over vast areas. Maybe they did later on, but at the time, as long as you could defeat navally, this is on the sea, as long as you could defeat all your opposition locally, you pretty much then had control of the trading networks. And so this was just a fortunate sort of confluence of events that all the competitors for this international trading market were all pretty much in the same place. Similarly, as Britain was an island, or England was an island, it didn't have to have a large standing army to be prepared against invasion or incursions of any sort. As long as their navy was up to it, then there was no other nation could land an army, because you need a lot of ships to land an army. You couldn't do it in secret. So there was a long period, years of forewarning if an invasion was coming or likely to come. So all the opposition, all the competitors, all were land-based. So the French, Spanish, and so on. So they all had to contend with the issue of having armies of the French, Spanish, and so on. So they all had to contend with the issue of having armies of their rivals that could march in. So if you've got a standing army, you can mobilise it along. So each nation there, the Spanish and the French, had to have a standing army, really, or certainly one they could get together quite quickly to combat their rivals. So there was the Spanish Empire, later on merging with the Habsburg and Holy Roman Empire, or the wider Catholic Empire. There was the French, of course. Then there were other empires that came and went that had to be dealt with. Sweden became quite a big player in the early 1700s. The Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of competition in Europe. And in addition to that, the Ottoman Empire was trying to spread the Islamic faith all through Europe, and they got as far as Vienna, for goodness sakes. They controlled all of the Balkans, Greece, what today is Serbia, Hungary, and Romania and Bulgaria. The Islamic Ottoman Empire controlled all of that, and then they went into to try and get into Central Europe, and even got as far as Austria. So they were. There needed to be standing armies to fight them. The British didn't take, or the English didn't take a major role in fighting the Turks, so they didn't have, certainly in the earlier days, they didn't have to divert resources off to that, whereas the others, the French and Spanish and so on, they did divert resources to that. Those wars with the Ottomans, the Islamic Ottomans, so that drew off resources that otherwise would have been used to squabble over the worldwide trading networks. So these were events, confluence of events, series of events, accidents of events, and so on and so forth, that allowed the English to allocate a larger amount of their resources into developing these worldwide trade, allowed the English to allocate a larger amount of their resources into developing these worldwide trading networks and to fighting off others that may want to deal themselves into that game, rather than fighting the land-based wars. And putting a big army on the ground and have it running around is a very expensive business. On a relative basis, you get much more return from a navy. and you can also have that option of the Navy of deciding where and when to strike. So if a Navy goes out of port and it's on its way to somewhere, where is it going? So often any show of force to do with a Navy is able to achieve objectives fairly quickly. And we saw this, say, with the Danes and the Vikings coming to parts of Europe, England as an example, during the 700s, 800s, 900s, and so on. They knew that there was a summer season when the Danes would come, but what day would they come? You can't have an army standing ready for weeks and weeks on end. So once they saw the Viking ships on the horizon, they had maybe a day, hours perhaps, depending on the wind, hours to assemble any sort of an army. And usually the Danes would arrive, the Vikings would arrive and these were experienced fighting men and so on. And it's the farmers that you would quickly get together with a few picks and axes to fight them. They were no match for those professional soldiers, in effect. So this was something that a Navy could achieve a lot more given its relative cost. So the English could achieve a lot more given its relative cost. So the English were able to have a very active military presence and naval presence at a price much less than it would cost to put on the ground. So this was because they had a sizable Navy. There was quite an effective Navy. Then it's very hard to get soldiers on the ground there. So they were pretty much protected, to a large extent at least, from invasion. It came pretty close during the 7 years in the Industrial Revolution that England had this. So there's these internal waterways, deep water ports, deep small but deep rivers and they used mainly flat bottom boats, by the way, that could be used to get around. There's a lot of burning coal, masses of burning coal, good quality coal. There was iron, working iron and copper and so on. There were the oak trees. So there's a whole lot of things we can't really define at the ingenuity and energy and focus of the people. Adam Smith, for example, his Wealth of Nations, and even later economists and so on would give this energy of the people, this ingenuity, would give it words like animal spirits and things like that to reflect. Because it's very hard to define. Some others seem to be they're just lazy. They don't give a shit. But the British, certainly at that time at least, were considered to be or demonstrated themselves to be quite energetic. Now, as the 7 Years' War is pretty much the defining point of the modern British Empire. In 1756, the war kicked off, and it was a war that variously included all Britain's major trading rivals: the Dutch, the French, and the Spanish. The Portuguese and the British kind of got together, following the marriage of that Portuguese princess to the English king. But all their rivals were pretty much in that war, and the British, to I think everyone's surprised, and even if you look back at that war and the people at the time, perhaps, and certainly later in history, the British were able to defeat the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch in that war. So it was a huge amount of force arrayed against them. But they had a very capable and energetic leaders at the time. William Pitt is an example. And there are many places in the United States still today named after William Pitt, Pittsburgh, and others, Pitt Town, and so on. With this good quality leadership, a good quality Navy, their financial management was excellent, and whereas all their rivals either just couldn't match them on the sea, their fleets were getting all shot up and sunk, or they just couldn't outlast them financially. So the British were able to send fleets around the world. So it's kind of a world war. Send fleets off to the West Indies, New York. That was once a Dutch trading colony, for example. So anyway, the British or the English came so it's really into their own around that time in the 1760s, which was about the time, and so on, and the use of steam was starting to take hold, which given that the English had already had this extensive mercantile trading empire in place, once they started to industrialize, and they were the first to industrialize, they were able to produce manufactured goods, exchanging them with raw materials, or taking raw materials from these colonies. Today, it's now ranked as a middleweight power. That's because other powers passed it and became much wealthier, much faster. And even though the British are richer, other powers became more richer faster. So that's the difference between absolute and relative power. So that's how Britain became sort of great and powerful and so on. And we need to understand this, that 50% of all ships on the water that were transporting goods around the world in the 1880s and 1890s were British. If you look at all the expansion in the United States of railways and canals and all sorts of things, all that money to do that was either raised in the London Stock Exchange, or it was British investors that were bankrolling it. There was hardly any major industrial works in the United States, certainly in that time, following the Civil War and so on, that wasn't bankrolled by British investors to at least a large degree, if not completely. Now, if you look back at the newspapers of, say, from mid-1880s onwards, sort of around that time it started, the newspapers began to sound alarm bells. And bear in mind that the press in those days was quite local. It was all the big cities had their own newspapers owned by different people and so on. There was none of these multinational control of the media or anything like that. So you had people that may have been pro the government or anti the government, but you had this huge diversity of opinion, given there were so many different owners of the newspapers. And that didn't mean that some newspapers weren't howlers full of Martians landed yesterday type thing, but nonetheless that there was this diversity of opinion. British industry wasn't renewing its factory equipment quickly enough. It was hanging on to old equipment for too long. And people would go and visit, say, the factories in the United States or Germany and even parts of France for that matter. And they would say, hey, these guys are using the latest equipment, they're using the latest. Once we lose our edge, we're going to lose our ability to command the global stage, which is a reasonable assumption, by the way. I don't know how many of you watched the movie The Godfather, the original Godfather movie, one of the great classic movies of all time. And they got into cronyism. But the Germans and the Americans didn't do that. They didn't go down that path. They made a decision to, get into new technologies such as electronics and chemicals and so on. They made the idea to get parts available, technical support, that sort of thing. So the Germans and the Americans went down that path. But they built this up behind tariff walls. So it seemed to go unnoticed to the British that these much better quality products were being made. Like much, but it's a major change. And the sort of people coming into Parliament were also changing from just being pure aristocrats to industrialists and middle class factory owners. Those sort of people were starting to come in as well. So it was changing the mix of the British Parliament, and hence the sort of policies and attitudes. They were far more commercial than they had been, or certainly around the 1850s and 1860s. But the British were very committed to free trade. So they had this view that there should be no quotas, there should be no tariffs and this sort of thing, or minimal quotas and tariffs. And the British, for example, opened up their own economy to import of cheap American grain. So the British were sort of living up to that, but really no one else was. Well, certainly not the bigger developing economies. France, the United States, Britain, and the other empires, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and so on. These all had tariffs to protect the local industries and local merchants. in the case of the Ottomans, mainly they were just the buddies of the Sultan and his bunch of cronies. But with particularly the Germans and the Americans, they were really putting all that effort into making world-class products that were starting to be far superior to anything that the British were making at the time. And the British would have needed to upgrade their technology to do it, and they didn't. But this increase in the amount of people voting, the amount of laws that were protecting workers and worker safety, upgrading the writs of habeas corpus, all these things combined to scare the ruling classes into thinking, well, and not the politicians didn't exhort some of the industrialists to say, well, hey, upgrade your machinery and make better quality competitive products. And that's heavy, guys. And there was a shrinking back from the sort of, wow, do we really have to spend that much? But it shows that if you're going to be economically preeminent, you've got to have the military clout to back it up, and that means you have to have the latest technology, the latest weaponry, and as much as deterrence to others that would try and get in your face, as much as it is to project power across the globe. And only an economy as rich, which is fairly new to the game, Germany again fairly new to the game, France and Britain. So there's only those four, and Britain having the biggest navy by far in those days. So. But this indicates that the cost of staying number one was increasing rapidly at the same time as two new and very vibrant, very capable and very technologically advanced competitors were arriving into the space, which these, of course, being Germany and the United States. So by the time World War I came along, Britain was already sort of number three, you could say. United States and Germany had already passed it. If it wasn't for the trade in invisibles such as insurances and shipping fees and financial commissions, wasn't for that, and Britain would have been an obvious number three. But the trade in invisibles, given it was so huge at the time, kind of masked the decline in manufacturing, evidently stronger in Britain, certainly in land-based military forces. And this was manifest in the quality of goods that the Germans were making, to their rifles, to their field artillery and so on. They were just better organised. Their soldiers were better trained, better equipped, and they were inflicting casualties on the Allies. The Germans were inflicting casualties on the Allies by inflicting three casualties for every two they received themselves. So, in some cases, even substantially wider than that in the Eastern Front fighting the Russians. So the British had to put a much greater economic effort into defeating the Germans than the Germans did to hang on for as long as they did. And even after the French and British economies that theoretically should have easily beaten the British economy, because the Germans conducted war so effectively and efficiently and so well, they probably, I think on balance, the Germans would have prevailed in that war. If anything, it would have been a terribly close run thing, which it was anyway, but they're likely to prevail. But the British economy was almost exhausted after that war, and was in no shape really to fight another war, and they were losing ground to the Americans if well-run Germany, and the British economy was in no shape to fight a war, certainly not of that size. And because the Germans were able to militarize of the entire European continent there for a while, the British were in no shape to really fight about that. And again, without the American assistance, there's just no way the British could have survived that war. So anyway, these are the things that. So come the end of World War II, the British are financially exhausted, and they've pretty much lost confidence in it. Even though they won, there's a lot of loss of confidence there, as I see it. Looking at the newspaper columns of the day, there was a lot of chutzpah. We won, but the reality is that they knew they were no longer a nation of the first rank, and were even struggling to hang on to the second rank. And by the 1970s, Britain was the economy of Britain was even falling behind that of Italy, which was considered a few years earlier to be a basket case. So that gives you an idea as to the decline of Britain and how it went from being top dog to being a power of the middle rank within such a short space of time. And it's interesting walking around London, where just not far from Buckingham Palace, where the Queen resides most of the time, you still see all the trappings of the 1901 British Jubilee, which was a huge celebration of empire, the greatness of the empire, the magnificence of the empire, and that's still there. And you walk past there, see the Islamic street hawkers, and you just see how far the decline's gone, and it's gone from a great empire to being, 100 years later, or just over 100 years later, looking like its days, its glory days are long behind it, and it's sad to see in such a short space of time that occurred. Now, in the post-war years, post-World War II, in the world going when really it wasn't. It was could help America on demand maybe, but beyond that, it really was reliant. Again, the proclivity of the ruling class to invest overseas rather than invest locally. The nationalistic sort of commitment of let's make our nation powerful and influential. The ruling classes weren't particularly interested in that, or certainly not to the extent that they had been previously. So all these things combined, the attitudes, the belief that no matter what we do, we can't address the problems, caused the empire to decline, and it was just a case of how fast. So maybe that'll give you some ideas and some considerations there of how all this happened. And I look forward to receiving your comments below. You've been with Tacitus today, and thank you.